her true story. From Tennessee, my son-in-law threw coffee at me and said, "You eat, but don't help," and slammed my plate down, so I sold the house while they slept. They said I took up space. I took the land instead. "You eat, but don't help," he barked, turning to me, his face red. "You just sit here like you're the queen of this house, and you sure as hell aren't entitled to live here like a damn freeloader." It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where the sun filtered lazily through the kitchen blinds and the smell of toast and coffee filled the air. I had gotten up early, as I always did, careful not to wake anyone. My knees creaked and ached with every step, but I had grown used to that. After all, when you're 72 and your hip has been through surgery, pain becomes as familiar as breath. I had made my way to the kitchen, set the table, like I used to when George was still alive, and waited. My daughter Lila came down first, in her robe, yawning and scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when I said good morning. Then came the kids, Olivia and Ben, 10 and 7. They smiled at me, sweet as always, and sat down to their usual spots. And then he entered, Derek, my son-in-law. 6'2", big-shouldered, with a look that could slice granite. He did not speak at first, just poured himself a cup of coffee, then grabbed a plate of eggs Leela had fried. He sat down heavily at the head of the table and began eating without a word. I sat in the far corner, like I always did now, at the edge of the table. My plate had one slice of toast and a bit of scrambled egg. I didn't want to be a burden. I never asked for anything more. I smiled. I always tried to smile. "Morning, Derek," I said, gently. He didn't respond. Just chewed, loud and hard. The silence thickened. Lila pretended not to notice. The kids whispered something to each other about a video game. I reached for my tea, trying not to spill, when Derek's chair suddenly screeched backward. "You know what? I'm sick of this," he said sharply. We all froze. "You eat, but don't help," he barked, turning to me, his face red. "You just sit here like you're the queen of this house." Lila's head snapped up. Olivia dropped her spoon. Ben shrank back into his seat. I looked at him, stunned. I try to help, Derek. My hip is still healing," the doctor said. He laughed, a cruel, joyless sound. "Your hip? You have been here for 6 months, doing nothing but taking up space, using our water, our electricity, eating our food." "Derek, please," Lila said under her breath, eyes wide. "Not now." But he wasn't finished. He grabbed his mug of coffee, still steaming, and in one sudden, violent motion, hurled it toward me. The hot liquid splashed across my lap, soaking my old blue nightgown, scalding my skin. I gasped, not from pain but from the shock. The mug clattered to the floor and rolled under the counter. I looked down at the brown stain spreading over the fabric, my hands shaking. The kids stared at me, eyes wide, mouths open. Then, as if that wasn't enough, Derek slammed his plate down onto the table, so hard the eggs bounced and the plate cracked. "I work 50 hours a week and come home to this?" he shouted. "A house full of people, eating and lounging while I pay for everything?" I sat frozen, the burn on my thigh throbbing. No one moved. Lila just stared at the table, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're not my mother," Derek said, voice low now, venomous. "And you sure as hell aren't entitled to live here like a damn freeloader." The words stabbed. It echoed in my head like a bullet ricocheting off bone. I turned to Lila, hoping, just hoping, for her to say something, anything, to stand up, to remind him that I was her mother, that I had raised her, fed her, sat by her bedside through every fever, saved every little card she made me, that this house once belonged to her father and me. But she only whispered, "Derek, just, not now, not now." The silence after that was louder than any scream. Olivia reached for a napkin and slowly offered it to me. I took it with trembling hands, wiping my dress, feeling the burn and the shame and the disbelief rise up my throat. "I think I'll go upstairs," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No one stopped me. As I climbed the steps, one at a time, gripping the banister with knotted fingers, I felt my chest tighten. Not from the pain, but from something far worse, the realization that I did not belong here anymore, that the home I had built, the family I had raised, the love I had poured, had no room left for me. At the top of the stairs I paused and looked back. Derek was already back in his chair, scrolling through his phone. Lila was gathering plates. The kids stared at their cereal bowls as if they held the secrets to the universe. That was the moment I knew. I was not a mother in this house, not a grandmother, not even a human being. I was just a ghost, sitting in a chair that no one wanted filled. I went upstairs like a ghost, each step heavy, each breath thinner than the last. My legs were soaked from the coffee, my nightgown clinging to my skin, stinging. The hallway felt colder than usual, though I knew it was only my body reacting to shock. I closed the door behind me, slowly, carefully, so it would not creak. Then I turned the lock, not because I feared anything more would happen, but because I needed more than anything to feel I still had some kind of control. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling in my lap. The thin floral blanket I used every night was still half folded, the pillow where I kept George's old handkerchief tucked beneath it. I stared at the brown stains on my legs and on the nightgown, watched them bloom like wounds. My fingers felt for the buttons at my collar. I undressed quietly, mechanically, and changed into a fresh housecoat, one of the few I had left that was not threadbare. Then I sat again, still listening. No one came up, no knock on the door, no footsteps, no apologies. They had already moved on with their morning. The silence felt deafening. I pressed a hand to my chest, and my fingers touched something beneath the fabric. I reached in and pulled out the small gold locket I wore every day, even now, even when they mocked me for being sentimental. I opened it with a soft click. Inside, the tiny photograph of George was still intact, black and white, his eyes serious, his jaw firm, the same way he looked the day he returned from war. And just like that, the years melted away. I closed my eyes. The scent of cedar and fresh paint filled the air, and George stood out front with sweat dripping from his brow and a hammer still in hand. He had spent months building that porch. He wanted everything to be perfect, every nail, every plank. He did not have to do it himself, but that was who he was. After returning from the war, George had said he wanted to create something with his hands, something peaceful, something solid. "This house will keep you safe when I'm gone," he told me once, holding my face in his rough, calloused hands. "That's why I'm building it with my own 2 fists." It was the spring of 1959 when we moved in. Back then, the house stood on an open stretch of Tennessee land, surrounded by fields and birdsong. There were no neighbors yet, just trees that swayed like they knew our names, and deer that wandered near the back fence. George painted the kitchen blue because he said it reminded him of my eyes. I cooked our first meal there, with flour still on my sleeves from baking cornbread. We laughed like fools, danced to a scratchy radio song in the living room even before the floor was sealed. And oh, how that house held us. Through everything, 3 children, 1 miscarriage, storms that battered the roof, winters where we kept warm by piling quilt high and sitting together in silence. The night our youngest, Lila, was born, George nearly broke every traffic law in the county just to get me to the hospital. And when he held her in his arms, his whole face softened, like every hard edge from the war had finally dissolved into something gentle. He was not a perfect man, but he loved us with a loyalty that never once cracked. Even in his final days, when the cancer had taken most of his strength, George insisted I wheel him out to the porch so he could watch the sunrise. That porch he built, that land he worked, that house he never stopped seeing as ours. The last thing he said to me in a clear voice, 2 days before he passed, was something I had never forgotten. "If they love you, they'll honor this house. They'll see what it means to you. If they don't, Mabel, don't sign anything. Not a damn thing. This house was built with love. Do not let them turn it into something ugly." He had looked me square in the eye. "Promise me," and I did. My fingers tightened around the locket. I had kept that promise. The papers they had asked me to sign, Lila and Derek. Right after George's funeral, I had smiled and said I would think about it. They brought them twice more, Lila with guilt in her eyes, Derek with irritation in his. But I never did sign. I tucked them away in the bottom drawer of George's old desk in this very room, right under the hand-sewn flag from his service and the little wooden box that held our wedding bands. I knew what they assumed, that I had eventually given in, that Lila, being our daughter, had inherited it automatically, that I had no reason to hold on. But they were wrong. I still held the deed, still held the power. And tonight, After what happened downstairs, after Derek's cruel words and that scalding coffee, I realized something George probably knew all along. Sometimes, love means protecting not just what was, but what still is, what still can be. I stood up slowly, walked across the room to the old desk, opened the drawer, and took out the file folder. It was a little dusty, but I knew the weight of it in my hands, like I knew the weight of George's voice in my heart. The transfer papers were still there, unsigned, and underneath them, the original deed. In my name, clear as daylight. I sat back on the bed, the papers in my lap, and stared at the signature line. Empty, waiting, powerful. In that moment, I no longer felt like a ghost. I felt like something I had not felt in months. Alive. And maybe, just maybe, it was time they remembered who this house really belonged to. At dinner that evening, I sat in silence, as I had learned to do. My plate was filled, as always, with whatever was left over after everyone else had served themselves. Lila handed it to me quietly, no eye contact, just a mechanical movement. The kids chattered about their day at school, Derek grunted at his phone while chewing, and the television murmured something forgettable from the living room. No one asked me how I was feeling. No one asked if the burn on my leg was better. It still hurt, reddish and sore. But I had learned long ago that physical pain was easier to endure than emotional bruising. I buttered my bread with slow, deliberate movements, like I was trying to fill time rather than a stomach. No one noticed. I had become a piece of the furniture in that house, a chair in the corner, a curtain no one opened. Sometimes Olivia would smile at me, and Ben would whisper, "Night, night, Grandma," when he remembered. But they were children, still innocent, not yet taught how to unsee someone. Lila caught my eye briefly and gave me that same tight-lipped expression. Then, in the kitchen after dinner, while I was rinsing my own plate under lukewarm water, she approached behind me. "Mom," she said softly, "please don't take what Derek said this morning to heart. He's been under a lot of stress at work." I turned the water off. I did not speak. She continued, a little more rushed now, like she just wanted the discomfort to end. "He's not a bad person. He loses his temper sometimes. He doesn't mean anything by it." I turned to look at her. Her eyes shifted to the floor. "He threw scalding coffee at me, Lila," I said quietly, "in front of your children." She bit her lip. "I know. I really need you to not make things harder right now. Please." I nodded once, turned back to the sink, and finished washing my plate. Harder. That was the word she used, as if I were a complication, not a mother, not a human being, just a burden that made her life harder. That night I sat in bed with a notepad and pen, one of the few things in the house that still felt like mine. I began writing things down, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Words, dates, phrases. January 18. You just eat and watch TV, at least the dog fetches. February 5. Threw my medication box in the drawer, said, "Keep your pills out of my kitchen." March 12th, rolled his eyes at my cardigan on the back of the chair. "Are you hanging laundry in my dining room now?" It became a small ritual, quiet, invisible. I hid the notebook beneath my pillow each morning. The act gave me back something small, my memory, my clarity, my truth. They might erase me with silence during the day, but I would write myself back into existence at night. I began to watch Derek more closely. The way he walked like the house was a stage and everyone in it owed him applause. The way Lila flinched when he raised his voice, even when it was not directed at her. The way he tossed his work boots into the hallway every evening, like the floor should be grateful to receive them. The colder Lila became, the more I felt her drifting, not just from me, but from herself. My daughter, once so full of laughter and rebellion, now moved like someone afraid of breaking. I wanted to ask her where the spark had gone, but the answer was too loud to ignore. It had been doused by years of trying to keep the peace that cost too much. One evening I was walking down the hallway when I heard Derek on the phone. His voice carried from the garage. I stopped, unseen, just outside the cracked door. "Nah, man," he was saying, chuckling. "I swear to God, it's like living with a ghost. The old lady just floats around the house, eats my food, says thank you like she's royalty, does not lift a damn finger, says her hip hurts. Hell, I'd rather clean a dog kennel than live with a mother-in-law who thinks she's owed the world." There was laughter on the other end of the line. Derek joined in. My heart slowed. Not stopped, just slowed. It was a strange feeling, somewhere between heartbreak and resignation. I turned and walked back to my room without making a sound. That night, I did not write in my notebook. I just stared at the ceiling, the shadows dancing across it from the streetlight outside. I replayed that sentence over and over. I'd rather clean a dog kennel. He thought I was less than an animal. I remembered a story George once told me, from his days in the service. He said the worst insult he ever heard was not shouted, but whispered behind someone's back. It wasn't the volume that hurt, he told me. It was the fact that someone believed it and thought no one else would care. Derek believed what he said, and he thought no one else would care, least of all, me. But I did care. I cared more than he could ever imagine, not because his words surprised me, but because they confirmed what I had feared for months. I was no longer Mabel, the woman who once made Thanksgiving dinners for 30 people in this very house. Not Mabel, who sewed Lila's prom dress when they couldn't afford the store-bought one. Not Mabel, who held her newborn grandchild in this living room and wept with joy. I was a placeholder, a background character in a story that had long since erased my name from the script. That was when I began to see the house differently, not as a home, but as a battleground of memory. And I realized in my bones that if I died tomorrow, they would not remember me as the woman who built a life here. They would remember me as the old lady who sat in the corner. And that was not going to be my ending. The next morning, before anyone else stirred, I unlocked the bottom drawer of George's old writing desk. The air was still and heavy, the kind of silence that clung to your skin. I knelt down, wincing slightly from the stiffness in my hip, and reached inside, pulling out a faded leather folder, one George had kept locked up for years. My fingers brushed over its surface like it was sacred, and to me it was. I opened it slowly, reverently. Inside were the documents, aged, yellowing slightly at the edges but crisp and intact. The deed to the house, the original transfer agreement George had drawn up with his lawyer nearly a decade ago. I remembered the meeting clearly, even though I had barely understood the legal terms at the time. It had been a quiet afternoon in our kitchen. George sat across from our longtime attorney, Mr. Hal Whitman, with a pen in hand and his brow furrowed, with the same serious look he wore whenever he was fixing something that mattered. I want the house to go to Lila someday, he'd said, but not automatically, not without Mabel's say-so. This place was built with her in mind. No one deserves it more than her, and if someone ever treats her like she's less than family, I want her to be able to say, "This is mine, and you don't belong here." I remembered the way George looked at me when he said that, not with sentiment, but with clarity, as though he knew, somehow, that a day might come when I would need that power. Mr. Whitman nodded and drafted the clause. The property would be willed to Lila in name, but the transfer of full ownership required one final signature, mine. And that signature, to this day, had never been written. I stared at the blank line again, now, years later, empty, waiting, the only thing between me and freedom. I held the papers tightly and placed them in a plain envelope, then slipped on my coat. The clock read 7:15 a.m. The house was still asleep. Derek never rose before 8 on weekends. Lila stayed in bed even longer. I had time. I took the local bus into town, sitting by the window, the folder pressed flat against my chest as if it could protect me from everything outside. The town had not changed much. Same streets, same coffee shop on the corner, same courthouse with peeling white paint. Mr. Hal Whitman still worked in the same building on Magnolia Street, just above the bakery that always smelled of cinnamon. I buzzed at the entrance and waited. He opened the door, startled at first, but then smiled gently. "Well, if it isn't Mabel Jennings, my God, it has been too long." I nodded, unable to keep my voice from shaking. "I need to talk to you about the house." He gestured me inside, and soon we were sitting across from each other, just like all those years ago. I pulled out the folder and placed the papers in front of him. "I never signed it, Hal," I said quietly, "but I think I might want to." He looked over the documents, carefully, adjusting his glasses. "You have every right to," he confirmed. "George structured this exactly how he said he would. It's all here, in black and white. You're the final authority." The words settled in the air like dust. I leaned back in the chair and let out a breath I had not realized I had been holding for months. "And if I choose to sell it?" "You can sell it, gift it, lease it, burn it to the ground," he said. "It's legally yours to decide." That made me smile, faintly. Burn it to the ground. The image was tempting. He hesitated for a moment. You thinking about leaving? I'm thinking about surviving, I said. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. We talked a while longer, discussing logistics. He said he could help manage the process quietly if that was what I needed. I told him it was exactly what I needed. Quiet, but final. When I stepped out of his office, the sky had brightened, and I felt strangely taller, like the air around me had shifted. I walked for a bit through the small downtown, past storefronts and flower beds, past children holding their parents' hands, and then I found myself pausing at a public bulletin board nailed to the side of the post office. Among the flyers for guitar lessons and lost cats was a printed notice in bold green letters, calling landowners, local conservation trust, seeking rural properties to develop nature reserve. Preserve Tennessee's natural heritage. Let your land become a legacy. A phone number was listed below. I stared at it. Then I read it again, and again. A slow, undeniable idea began to form. I thought about the land behind our house, the wide open space, the trees that still remembered George's hands, the field where Lila used to run through wildflowers. I remembered how George would say, "This place is peace. I want it to stay peaceful long after we're gone." Maybe. It still could be. I pulled the flyer down and folded it into my coat pocket. When I got home, I went straight to my room and pulled out a local map from George's old filing cabinet. I spread it out over the bed and ran my finger over the lines that bordered our land. 22 acres, undeveloped, still zoned as private residential. Exactly the kind of land a conservation group might want. Exactly the kind of land they were searching for. I sat back and stared at the map, the realization settling over me like the first cool breeze after a brutal summer. If I sold this house, not to Lila, not to Derek, not to any of the neighbors, but to someone who would protect it, preserve it, keep it out of their hands forever, that would be the justice George would have wanted, and the revenge I had never allowed myself to consider until now. I folded the map carefully, placed it next to the flyer, and sat in the silence of my room, hearing the echoes of Derek's laughter from downstairs and Lila's voice calling the kids to come clean up. They thought I was a shadow, but they had no idea the light was about to shift, and when it did, they would see me clearly, for the first time in years. I waited until late Monday morning, when I knew the house would be empty. Derek had gone to work early, grumbling about traffic like always, and Lila had taken the kids to their piano and karate classes. The only sounds were the distant hum of the fridge and the ticking clock above the kitchen window. I sat down at George's old desk, with the flyer laid out beside me, and dialed the number listed at the bottom. The phone rang twice. "Thank you for calling the Tennessee Land and Conservation Trust. How may I help you?" A bright, polite voice answered. I cleared my throat. "Yes, good morning. I saw your flyer downtown. About the land purchase." "Yes, ma'am. We're currently reviewing several properties for our reserve project. May I ask your name?" I hesitated just a beat. "Actually, I'd prefer not to give my full name over the phone. Not yet. I'm in a delicate situation." A pause. Then warmth returned. "Of course, ma'am. We understand privacy. Would you like to schedule a discreet assessment?" "Yes. I'd like someone to come take a look, quietly. I don't want anyone in the household to know. Is that possible?" "Certainly. We've done off-record evaluations before. What's the property address?" I gave it, slowly and clearly. My heart was pounding by the end of the call. They scheduled a private visit for Thursday afternoon. When I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long moment, then tucked it back in the drawer. A strange calmness came over me, like the kind you feel before a storm, when everything goes eerily still. That Thursday, at precisely 2:30, a beige SUV pulled up to the edge of the property. 2 individuals stepped out, a woman in her 30s wearing a utility vest with a Trust's logo, and a man carrying a clipboard. I met them at the back gate, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and old gardening gloves. I had dressed purposefully in plain clothes, and greeted them with a slight southern accent I hadn't used in years. "Y'all the folks from the Trust?" I asked. The woman smiled. "We are. We're here to evaluate the land." "Well, the owners ain't home," I said, nodding toward the house. "I'm just the caretaker. Been tending to this place since the old man passed. You'll have to be quiet." They exchanged a glance, then nodded in understanding. I led them around the property, pointing out the boundaries, the tree line, the small creek that still ran clean through the southern edge of the pasture. They took photos, marked notes, murmured to each other. They asked about soil quality, wildlife sightings, zoning restrictions. I answered everything. I had lived on this land for over 40 years. I knew it better than I knew the back of my own hands. Before they left, the woman turned to me and said, "We'd be very interested. If you're the one with authority, we'd love to send over an offer and draft paperwork for review." "I am," I said softly. "And yes, please do." That night, I couldn't sleep, not from anxiety, but from adrenaline. The next day, the email arrived. The offer was fair, more than fair. Enough for me to leave, enough to begin again. Enough to ensure Derek and Lila would never step foot on this land again. I printed the documents, sat down with a steady hand, and signed the intent to transfer. It was a quiet victory, and yet my fingers trembled just slightly. I sealed the envelope, wrote the date for notarization on the top, and slid it into the drawer alongside the original deed. All that remained was the final signature at the courthouse. That night, as the sun dipped below the trees, casting long golden shadows across the living room floor, I stood quietly in my room and began folding clothes. One by one, neatly and without rush, I filled a small suitcase. Not everything, just enough. My nightgown, my locket, the notebook, a framed photo of George, the leather folder, a worn Bible, 2 scarves, my arthritis cream, a small jar of peppermint candies. It was peaceful, almost meditative, like preparing for a long-awaited trip. Then I heard laughter from the living room. I paused. Peering through the narrow crack in the door, I saw them. Derek with his feet on the coffee table, arm wrapped around Lila, both of them watching some sitcom, chuckling like everything in the world was fine. Like the insults, the dismissals, the coffee, the silence, they had never happened. My daughter leaned her head on his shoulder. He leaned down and kissed the top of her hair. The sound of their joy rang in my ears like static. And still, I said nothing. Just closed the door and zipped the suitcase. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it made me sad, but because it made me certain. They thought I was upstairs, invisible, but I was downstairs in my mind, opening the future one zipper at a time. Tomorrow I would leave this house not as a victim, but as its rightful owner, signing it away to a future where they would never belong. The morning was still dark when I slipped out the front door, the sky just beginning to lift its curtain of stars. I moved quietly, careful not to let the old hinges squeak, clutching my purse with both hands. Inside was everything I needed: the notarized documents, the original deed, my ID, and a small envelope with the last letter George ever wrote me, just for strength. The house was silent behind me. No footsteps, no children awake, no shouting, no cruel laughter, only the low hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the settling wood. They were all still asleep. I stood at the curb for a moment, breathing in the cold Tennessee air. It tasted like freedom. A yellow taxi rolled up exactly at 6:15 as I had scheduled. The driver, a young man with music playing low on the radio, helped load my small suitcase into the back. He did not ask questions. I was grateful. "Downtown?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Courthouse first, then one more stop." We drove in silence. At the county clerk's office, I submitted every document in that envelope, with hands steady as stone. The woman behind the counter smiled, checked the paperwork, and nodded. "Everything looks good, Miss Jennings. The conservation group wired the funds just this morning. We've already received verification. So quick, and so simple, so irreversible." I asked for a copy of the completed transaction for my records. As she printed the final page, she said, "You know, it's rare we see folks donate land like this. You're preserving something real special." I smiled. "That's the idea." From there, I had the taxi take me across town to visit a friend I hadn't seen in years. Marjorie Blackwell, a widow like me, with a sharp wit and a porch full of wind chimes. We had fallen out of touch after George passed, mostly my doing. But when I called her last week and asked if I could stay for a few days, she didn't hesitate. "Of course you can," she'd said. "I've got a warm bed and fresh pie. You just bring your stories." She didn't ask why I was leaving. She just opened her door and wrapped me in a hug. That afternoon, I received confirmation from the trust. The transfer of land had gone through. The house and acreage were now officially part of the Tennessee Reserve Project, effective immediately. I spent the next day reading on Marjorie's porch, watching squirrels chase each other across the roofline. There was no bitterness in my heart, just stillness, the kind that comes after a storm you've survived and finally stepped out from under. But back at the house, my former house, things were not so calm. At precisely 10:07 a.m. the next morning, Derek answered the door to find two uniformed county officers and a legal representative from the Conservation Trust standing on the porch. "Is this the residence of Derek and Lila Sanders?" the officer asked. Derek blinked. "Yeah? We are here to inform you that the property you are occupying has been legally transferred. You are now considered tenants, without contract or right of residence. You are being issued a 48-hour notice to vacate." He laughed. "What the hell are you talking about? My wife owns this house." The representative handed him a folder. "She does not. Never did. The house was never signed over. Ms. Mabel Jennings retained full authority. She has executed a legal sale. The property now belongs to the Tennessee Land and Conservation Trust." Lila appeared behind him, barefoot and panicked, eyes wide as she grabbed the papers. No, this has to be a mistake. My mom lives here. This is our home. Our kids' home." The officer remained calm. "Ma'am, you'll have to take it up in court if you believe your rights were violated, but I assure you the transaction is legitimate. You must vacate the premises within 48 hours or face legal removal." Chaos erupted. Lila cried out, begging to see me. Derek cursed so loudly the neighbor across the street stepped out onto their porch. Olivia and Ben stood behind their mother, silent, clinging to each other. Then came the moment I had prepared for. I arrived 15 minutes later, walking down the gravel path toward the house in a simple navy coat, holding the legal agreement in my hand like a folded flag. The officer turned. "Mrs. Jennings?" I nodded. Lila spotted me first. "Mom!" She ran toward me, tears streaking her face. "What did you do? Why would you do this? We needed you, the kids. This is their home." I looked her in the eyes and said nothing for a moment. I needed her to feel the silence the way I had for months. Then I said calmly, "You said I took up space." Derek stormed toward me, fists clenched. "You had no right. This was my home too." I turned to him, standing taller than I had in years. "Your home? You hurled coffee at me like I was garbage. You mocked me to your friends. You lived under my roof and acted like I was the stray dog." He opened his mouth, but I raised my hand. "You all said I didn't belong, that I was in the way. Well, I was never in the way. I was the foundation." I stepped closer and held out the deed in my hand. "I built this life. I built this house. And now I'm building something else." I paused, then delivered the final words like a stone dropping into water. "I didn't take up space. I was the space. And now this space is no longer yours." With that, I turned and walked away, the wind light against my back. The weight I had carried for so long lifted at last. I never imagined myself starting a foundation. Truth be told, I never even imagined leaving that house. For years, I thought I would simply fade into the wallpaper, pass quietly in my sleep, and be remembered only by the shadows that collected in the corners of the hallway. But sometimes it only takes one broken plate, one thrown cup of coffee, one final insult to wake something up inside you. 2 weeks after the sale was finalized and the property fully transferred to the Tennessee Land and Conservation Trust, I sat across from my attorney in his office, the sun warm through the window as we reviewed the wire transfer confirmation. "Everything looks good," he said, sliding the papers into a neat folder. "So, what will you do next?" I smiled slowly, a little shy at first. "I want to help people like me. People who were forgotten inside their own families. People who still have value, even if no one at their dinner table can see it anymore." He raised his brows. "Like a non-profit?" "Exactly like that," I said. "I already have a name for it." I pulled out a napkin from my purse, where I had scribbled the letters, Mobile, Make a Better Elder Life. He chuckled. Catchy. And fitting. With his help and a friend from the local bank, I opened an account and filed the paperwork to establish the foundation legally. Within a month, I had set up a small team, volunteers at first, mostly women from my old quilting circle, a retired social worker, and one energetic college intern named Darius, who called me Miss Mabel like I was royalty. We started small, care packages for homebound elders, monthly phone calls to check in on seniors living alone, legal guidance for those facing property abuse or coercion. But the most powerful thing we offered, it turned out, wasn't food or funding. It was voice. We hosted our first community talk in the basement of a Unitarian church on a Thursday night. I thought maybe 5 people would show up. 30 came. By the second event, we had nearly 70. Grandmothers, veterans, widowers, a quiet man who had been kicked out of his daughter's house after his stroke, a woman whose family refused to visit unless she handed over her Social Security checks. I stood up in front of them, heart pounding, and told them my story, from the burn on my thigh to the deed in my name, from the silence at the dinner table to the knock on the door that changed everything. I told them about George and the promise I had kept, and when I finished, there was no applause, just silence. But not the cold kind. This silence was full, heavy, reverent. Then someone clapped, and another, and then they stood, some crying, some nodding. The next morning, a local news crew called and asked if I would share my story on air. Apparently, someone had recorded part of the talk and posted it online. I hesitated. "I'm not sure I want to become a spectacle," I said. But the young producer on the line replied, "Miss Mabel, you're not a spectacle. The segment aired the following week. They filmed me sitting on Marjorie's porch, sipping sweet tea, the wind chimes dancing behind me. They added soft piano music and cut in images of my old house, now with a sign posted out front. Protected land, future site of Tennessee Natural Preserve." The story took off. Before I knew it, I was invited to speak on a podcast, then at a state elder rights summit in Nashville. Strangers began sending letters, some from as far as Oregon and Maine. Many started the same way. "I saw you on the news and cried. I've been living like a ghost too. You reminded me that I am not invisible." At some point, a radio host nicknamed me the coffee lady who took the land. I thought it would bother me, but it didn't. In fact, I laughed. Yes, that's exactly who I was. I was the woman who'd had hot coffee hurled at her in her own kitchen and turned that humiliation into something sacred. I was the woman who'd been called a burden, a problem, too old, and turned her silence into a megaphone. The Mabel Foundation continued to grow. We secured a grant to create an emergency housing fund for elders in domestic crisis. We partnered with local churches and libraries to offer workshops on property law and inheritance rights. We launched a hotline. Darius built a website. Marjorie ran our Facebook page, posting quotes from our talks and pictures of the cookies we served at meetings. At the one-year anniversary of the foundation's founding, we held an outdoor celebration in the new reserve where my house once stood. The trees stood tall, the wind was cool, the land was quiet, and under a large oak tree, a brass plaque had been installed. It read, "In honor of Mabel Jennings. She took up space and gave it back, a guardian of dignity." I stood in front of that plaque, tears in my eyes, surrounded by people, many of them older, many of them forgotten by their own, but standing tall, holding hands, smiling. I felt George then, not just in memory, in presence, like he was leaning just over my shoulder, whispering, "Told you not to sign anything." That night, back at Marjorie's, I looked into the mirror and hardly recognized myself. Not because I looked younger, but because I looked awake, bright, whole. I smiled, not the careful smile I used at family dinners, not the polite one I wore in their house, but a real one, wide and unashamed. It was the first smile in years that felt like it belonged entirely to me. I used to believe that once your children grew up, your job was to disappear quietly, to not cause trouble, to not take up space. But I've learned that some things, like dignity, like your voice, are worth taking space for. After selling the house, I didn't just find freedom, I found a chance to do something meaningful. So I founded the Mabel Foundation, Make a Better Elder Life. It started on Marjorie's kitchen table with a pen, a notepad, and a cold cup of tea. MABCL wasn't just my name anymore, it became a mission. We began by helping isolated elders, delivering groceries, organizing support circles, and simply listening. For many, it was the first time they'd spoken their pain out loud. One woman said, "I didn't think anyone would care if I disappeared." That's when I knew we were doing something that mattered. Then, someone shared a video of me telling my story, from the coffee thrown at me to the deed I never signed. It went viral. Letters poured in. People said I gave them permission to stand up. When the news called me the coffee lady who took the land, I didn't flinch. That coffee cup? It drew a line. I stepped over it and found myself again. I didn't just reclaim a house. I reclaimed me. My days are quieter now, and finally mine. I live in a small white house with green shutters on the edge of a forest, where the mornings begin with tea and bird song, and the evenings end with golden lamplight and the rustle of pine trees. The rocking chair on my porch creaks like an old friend, reminding me that I am still here, still choosing peace over noise. People come sometimes, strangers who've heard about the coffee lady who took the land, women who feel invisible, who've been silenced too long. They come with stories. I listen. I offer tea, and if they ask for advice, I give only what I know. That silence is not love, and forgiveness is not permission to return to harm. Last month, a letter came from my daughter. She said sorry. She said she left him. I read her words, folded them gently, and placed the letter in my drawer. I forgave her, but I didn't write back. Some doors don't need reopening to heal. Each night, I whisper to George's photo. I didn't sign it, and I didn't become a shadow. Then I sleep, light as air, dreaming only of trees and the quiet I've finally earned. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. Thank you for listening, not just to a tale, but to a journey of dignity, resilience, and quiet strength. Mabel's story wasn't just about a deed that was never signed. It was about people like her, elders who were once seen as a burden, but in truth are the roots holding entire families together. In the end, she didn't just take back a house, she reclaimed her voice, her worth, and her power to choose peace over silence. If you believe that older people deserve to be heard, respected, and remembered, subscribe to Grandma True Stories today. Here we share deeply emotional and powerful true stories each week about grandmothers, mothers, and those who were once forgotten, but found their strength when no one expected it. Click subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a story that just might change how you see the world. Grandma True Stories, because truth has no expiration date and courage is never too late.